The black car stopped in front of the Grandview Hotel. It was a fancy car that cost more money than most people made in a year. The driver got out and opened the back door. A tall man stepped out onto the sidewalk. Alexander Whitmore looked at the hotel building and frowned. He wore an expensive black suit that fit him perfectly. His shoes were shiny and new. His hair was combed back without a single strand out of place. Everything about him screamed money and class. "This place is smaller than I expected," Alexander said to his assistant, who was following behind him with 2 large suitcases. The assistant, a nervous young man named Peter, nodded quickly. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore, but they said it has good sound quality for your performance tonight." Alexander walked through the glass doors of the hotel. The lobby was nice, but not as fancy as the places he usually stayed. There were comfortable chairs, nice paintings on the walls, and a large chandelier hanging from the ceiling. But to Alexander, it all looked cheap and ordinary. The hotel manager, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, walked over to greet them. "Mr. Whitmore, welcome to Grandview Hotel. We are so honored to have you perform at our charity event tonight." Alexander barely looked at her. "Where's the piano? I need to see it immediately." "Of course. Right this way, please." The manager led him across the lobby to a large room with tall windows. In the center of the room sat a black grand piano. Alexander walked around the piano like a doctor examining a sick patient. He touched the wood and looked at the keys. His face showed more and more disappointment with each step. "This piano is at least 20 years old," he said, shaking his head. "The wood has scratches. Look at these keys. Some of them are slightly yellow. How do you expect me to perform on this thing?" The hotel manager looked worried. "Sir, we had it tuned just yesterday. Our piano technician said it sounds beautiful." Alexander let out a short, mean laugh. "Your piano technician probably learned his trade from watching videos on the internet. I have performed in the greatest concert halls in the world. I have played pianos worth more than this entire hotel. This instrument is barely good enough for a student recital." He sat down at the piano bench and played a few notes. The sound was actually quite good, but Alexander's face showed nothing but disgust. "The touch is all wrong, the pedals are too loose, the sound is muddy and unclear." Peter set down the suitcases and whispered, "Should I call about getting a different piano, Mr. Whitmore?" "There is no time for that now," Alexander said loudly, making sure everyone in the room could hear him. "I suppose I will have to make do with this poor excuse for an instrument. It will not be easy to create art with such limited tools." A small group of hotel guests had gathered to watch the famous pianist. They whispered to each other about how exciting it was to see a real celebrity. But Alexander's rude behavior made them feel uncomfortable. Near the windows, a woman in a hotel uniform was arranging fresh flowers in a tall vase. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wore the blue dress that all the hotel housekeepers wore. Her name was Maria Santos, and she had been working at the hotel for 3 years. Maria tried to focus on her work, but she could not help listening to the pianist's complaints. She loved music and had always been drawn to the sound of piano. When she was arranging flowers near the piano, she sometimes hummed quietly to herself. Today, as she worked with the yellow roses and white lilies, a soft melody came from her lips. It was a song her grandmother used to sing to her when she was little. The tune was simple but beautiful. Alexander heard the humming and turned around with an annoyed look on his face. "Excuse me," he said in a sharp voice. "I am trying to concentrate. Here, could you please do your work somewhere else?" Maria looked up, surprised. "I am sorry, sir. I was just finishing the flowers." "Well, finish them quietly," Alexander said. "Some of us are trying to prepare for serious musical work." The hotel manager quickly stepped forward. "Maria, perhaps you could come back later to finish the arrangements." "It is okay," Maria said softly. "I am almost done." Alexander watched her with cold eyes. Everything about this woman annoyed him. Her simple clothes, her common accent, the way she seemed to think she could hum while he was trying to work. She represented everything he looked down on, ordinary people who knew nothing about real music or art. "Tell me," Alexander said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Do you even know what type of piano this is? Maria looked at him calmly. It is a Steinway Model M, made sometime in the early 2000s. It is a good piano, just needs some care. Alexander was surprised that she knew the brand, but he quickly covered his shock with more arrogance. Lucky guess. I suppose you read the name on the front. Actually, I can tell by the sound and the size, Maria said, still arranging the last few flowers. Steinway pianos have a special tone. This one sounds a little dull because the hammers need work, but the basic sound is still there. Now Alexander was really annoyed. How dare this cleaning woman pretend to know about pianos? I suppose you think you are some kind of music expert? Maria finished with the flowers and picked up her supplies. No, sir. I just know a little about pianos. A little? Alexander stood up and crossed his arms. Let me guess. You took a few lessons as a child. Maybe you can play Happy Birthday with one finger. Some of the hotel guests looked uncomfortable with how mean Alexander was being, but Maria just smiled politely. I learned to play when I was young, she said, but that was a long time ago. I am sure it was very impressive, Alexander said, with a nasty smile. Did you play at your school talent show? Maybe at a church social? The hotel manager tried to step in. Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should let you get back to your practice. But Alexander was enjoying himself now. He loved proving how much better he was than ordinary people. No. I am curious about our music expert here. Tell me, what is the most difficult piece you have ever attempted? Maria was quiet for a moment. She could see that this man wanted to make fun of her, but there was something in his attitude that reminded her of bullies she had known in school. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with bullies was to stay calm and not give them what they wanted. I should get back to my work now, she said. I hope your performance goes well tonight, Mr. Whitmore. As Maria started to walk away, Alexander called after her. That is what I thought. All talk, no substance, just like most people who think they understand music. Maria stopped and turned around. For the first time, there was a spark in her eyes that had not been there before. The hotel guests and staff watched in silence, sensing that something important was about to happen. Actually, Mr. Whitmore, Maria said, her voice still calm but stronger now. I think the problem with this piano is not the instrument itself. Sometimes when a musician cannot make beautiful music, they blame their tools instead of looking at their own heart. The room became very quiet. Alexander's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, especially not a hotel worker. How dare you, he said, his voice shaking with rage. Do you have any idea who you are talking to? Alexander's face was now bright red. His hands were shaking with anger. No one had ever talked to him the way this cleaning woman just did. He was Alexander Whitmore, one of the most famous pianists in the country. People paid hundreds of dollars just to hear him play. And here was this nobody in a cheap uniform telling him that he had no heart. Do you know who I am? Alexander said again, his voice getting louder. I have played in Carnegie Hall. I have performed with the New York Philharmonic. I have won more awards than you have probably ever heard of. Maria stood quietly, still holding her cleaning supplies. She did not look scared or sorry. This made Alexander even more angry. You think you can insult me? Alexander continued. You, a hotel maid who probably never finished high school. You dare to tell me about music and heart? The hotel manager stepped forward looking very worried. Mr. Whitmore, please, I am sure Maria did not mean any disrespect. She is a good worker and... A good worker? Alexander laughed, but it was not a happy sound. A good worker who thinks she knows more about pianos than a world-class musician? Peter, Alexander's assistant, whispered urgently. Sir, maybe we should focus on preparing for tonight's performance. But Alexander was too angry to listen. All his life, he had been told he was special, better than other people. His wealthy parents had paid for the best teachers, the best schools, the best everything. He had never been challenged by someone he considered beneath him. You know what? Alexander said, walking closer to Maria. I think you need to learn your place. You say you know about pianos? You say this old piece of junk just needs someone with heart to play it? The small crowd of hotel guests was getting bigger. Word was spreading through the hotel that something interesting was happening in the piano room. Some people looked excited, but others seemed uncomfortable with how mean Alexander was being. Maria set down her cleaning bucket and looked directly at Alexander. "I did not mean to insult you, Mr. Whitmore. I was just saying that a good musician can make any piano sound beautiful." "Is that so?" Alexander's eyes were cold and mean. "Then I challenge you to prove it." The room became very quiet. Everyone stared at Maria, waiting to see what she would say. "I do not understand," Maria said. Alexander smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "It is simple. You think you know about music? You think this piano just needs someone with heart? Then, show us, play something." Maria shook her head. "I do not think that is a good idea." "Of course you do not," Alexander said triumphantly. "Because you know you cannot do it. You are just talking big to impress people. But when it comes time to actually perform, you have nothing to offer." The hotel manager looked embarrassed. "Mr. Whitmore, I really think we should—" "No," Alexander said firmly. "This woman insulted my abilities as a musician. She suggested that I lack heart. I think she should prove that she can do better." An older man in the crowd spoke up. "Come on, man, leave her alone. She is just trying to do her job." Alexander turned to face the crowd. "This woman claims to understand music better than a trained professional. I think she should demonstrate her expertise, unless, of course, she was just lying." Maria felt all eyes on her. She had not wanted this attention. All she had wanted was to finish arranging the flowers and go back to cleaning rooms. But something about Alexander's attitude made her think of all the times in her life when people had looked down on her because she was poor, because she cleaned hotels for a living, because she had not finished college. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Maria said quietly. Alexander's smile got bigger. "Play the piano. Show everyone how it should be done. Prove that you really know about music." "I told you I have not played in a long time." "How long?" Alexander pressed. Maria was quiet for a moment. "About 10 years." The crowd made small sounds of surprise. 10 years was a long time to go without playing. 10 years, Alexander said, loudly. "And you think you can criticize my playing? You think you can judge this piano?" "I never said I could play better than you," Maria said. "I just said—" "You said the piano was fine, and that good musicians can make any instrument sound beautiful," Alexander interrupted. "So prove it, unless you admit you were wrong." Maria looked around the room at all the faces watching her. Some people looked curious, some looked worried, and some looked excited like they were watching a show. She saw the hotel manager looking nervous, probably worried about what her boss would say if a fight started in the hotel. "I really should get back to work," Maria said. "Running away?" Alexander taunted. "I thought so. All talk, no action. Just like most people who pretend to know about art." Something in his tone made Maria stop. She had dealt with people like Alexander before, people who thought they were better than everyone else because they had money or education or fancy jobs. She had always walked away from confrontation, always kept her head down and tried not to make trouble. But today felt different. Maybe it was because Alexander was being so cruel in front of all these people. Maybe it was because he seemed to enjoy humiliating her. Or maybe it was because she was tired of always having to prove that she deserved respect. "Okay," Maria said softly. "What?" Alexander was not sure he heard her correctly. "I said, okay, I will play something." The room buzzed with excitement. People started whispering to each other. Someone pulled out their phone to record what was about to happen. Alexander felt a moment of doubt. He had expected her to back down, to admit she was just a cleaning lady who knew nothing about music. He had not expected her to actually accept his challenge. But it was too late to take it back now. Besides, how good could she really be? She worked as a hotel maid. She had not played piano in 10 years. Even if she had some basic skills, she could never match his training and experience. "Excellent," Alexander said, his confidence returning. But let us make this interesting. This will not be just any performance. This will be a competition. A competition? Maria asked. Yes, a musical duel. I will play first to show you what real piano playing sounds like. Then you can try to match it. The audience can judge who plays better. The hotel manager looked alarmed. I do not think this is appropriate. It is fine, Maria said, surprising everyone, including herself. But I have one condition. Alexander raised an eyebrow. You are making conditions? You are hardly in a position to negotiate. If I do this, Maria said, you have to promise to treat the hotel staff with respect for the rest of your stay. No more complaints about things that are perfectly fine. No more rude comments to people who are just trying to do their jobs. Alexander laughed. You think you are going to win? Fine, I promise. But when you lose, and you will lose, you have to admit in front of everyone that you know nothing about music and that you were wrong to criticize me. Maria nodded. Fair enough. The crowd was getting excited now. More people had arrived, including some hotel staff who had heard about the challenge. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when the famous pianist faced off against the humble cleaning woman. Alexander walked to the piano bench and sat down with great ceremony. He adjusted the bench height and position with exaggerated care. He flexed his fingers and cracked his knuckles dramatically. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the crowd, you are about to witness the difference between a true artist and someone who just thinks they understand music. He placed his hands on the keys and paused for effect. The room was completely silent. I will play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. Pay attention to the technique, the precision, the years of training that go into a performance like this. Maria stood to the side watching quietly. Her heart was beating fast, but her face remained calm. She knew she was taking a big risk. It had been so long since she had played in front of anyone. But something told her this was important, not just for her, but for all the people like her who were always being told they were not good enough. Alexander began to play. His fingers moved quickly across the keys, hitting every note with perfect accuracy. The music filled the room, complex and impressive. It was clear that he was an excellent pianist with years of training. But as Maria listened, she noticed something. The music was technically perfect, but it felt cold somehow. It was like watching a machine play, rather than a human being. There was no warmth, no emotion, just technical skill on display. The audience was impressed by Alexander's ability, but they did not seem moved by the music. They watched with respect but not with joy or feeling. When Alexander finished, there was polite applause. He stood up and bowed deeply, clearly pleased with himself. There, he said, looking at Maria. That is what real piano playing sounds like. Now let us see what you can do. Maria walked slowly toward the piano. Her legs felt shaky, but she kept her face calm. She had no idea if she could still play well after so many years. But she was about to find out. Maria walked toward the piano slowly. Each step felt heavy. She could feel everyone in the room watching her. Some people looked excited, like they were watching a game. Others looked worried, as if they knew she was about to be embarrassed. Alexander stood next to the piano with his arms crossed, smiling confidently. He had just played one of the hardest pieces of classical music perfectly. There was no way this cleaning woman could match what he had just done. Take your time, Alexander said in a voice that sounded kind but was really mocking. I know this must be very scary for you. Maria reached the piano bench and paused. The black and white keys looked the same as they had when she was young. But so much had changed since then. Her hands were different now, rough from years of cleaning with small scars from kitchen work and housekeeping. These were not the soft, smooth hands of a concert pianist. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. The crowd was completely silent, waiting to see what would happen. Maria placed her hands on her lap and closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she went back to when she was 8 years old. She remembered sitting at an old piano in her grandmother's small house. Her grandmother, Elena, had been a music teacher before she got married. Even though Elena did not have much money, she had kept her old piano and taught Maria to play. Music is not about showing off, her grandmother used to say. Music is about sharing your heart with other people. The piano does not care if you are rich or poor. It only cares if you have something real to say. Maria opened her eyes and looked down at the keys. Her grandmother had been dead for 15 years, but she could still hear her voice. "What are you waiting for?" Alexander asked impatiently. "Are you having second thoughts? It is not too late to admit you made a mistake." Maria did not answer. She placed her hands gently on the keys and pressed down softly. The sound that came out was just a simple chord, but it was warm and clear. Even that small sound made some people in the crowd lean forward with interest. "I have not done this in a long time," Maria said quietly, more to herself than to the audience. "I hope I remember how." Alexander laughed. "This should be entertaining. Please do not let my performance pressure you. Just play whatever simple song you know. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star would be fine." Some people in the crowd frowned at Alexander's mean comment. They were starting to dislike his attitude even if they were impressed by his skill. Maria began to play. She chose a piece she had learned as a teenager, Chopin's Minute Waltz. It was not the hardest piece in the world, but it was not easy either. It required quick finger work and a light touch. At first, Maria's playing was a little shaky. Her fingers stumbled on a few notes and she could feel Alexander's smug smile getting bigger. Some people in the crowd looked embarrassed for her. But then, something wonderful happened. As Maria continued playing, her muscle memory began to return. Her fingers started to remember the patterns they had learned so many years ago. The shakiness disappeared and the music began to flow. The difference between Maria's playing and Alexander's was immediately obvious. Where Alexander's performance had been cold and perfect, Maria's was warm and alive. She was not just hitting the right notes, she was telling a story with the music. Alexander's confident smile began to fade. This was not what he had expected. The cleaning woman was actually playing well, very well, but Maria was just getting started. As she became more comfortable, she began to add her own touches to the piece. She played some sections faster, others slower. She added little flourishes that were not in the original music but sounded perfect. The crowd was no longer just watching politely. They were truly listening now. Some people had their eyes closed, letting the music wash over them. Others were smiling without realizing it. Maria finished the Chopin piece and moved seamlessly into another song. This one was not classical at all. It was a folk song her grandmother had taught her. But Maria played it with such beauty that it sounded like it belonged in a concert hall. As she played, Maria forgot about Alexander and the crowd. She forgot about the challenge and her nervousness. She was lost in the music, remembering all the times she had sat at her grandmother's piano, all the dreams she had once had, all the songs that had lived in her heart even during the years when she could not play. Alexander watched in growing shock. This was not possible. This woman was a hotel maid. She had not played in 10 years, but she was playing with a skill and feeling that he had rarely heard, even from professional musicians. The audience was completely captivated now. People had stopped whispering to each other and were listening with their full attention. Some had tears in their eyes, though they could not have explained why. Maria played several more pieces, each one more beautiful than the last. She played some classical music, some folk songs, and some pieces that seemed to come from her own imagination. Her hands moved across the keys like they had never stopped playing. An older woman in the crowd whispered to her husband, "I have never heard anything so beautiful." A man near the back of the room said quietly, "She is making that piano sing." Even some of the hotel staff had gathered to listen. They had worked with Maria for years, but had no idea she could do this. Alexander stood frozen, watching his world change in front of his eyes. Everything he believed about talent, about class, about who deserved respect, was being challenged by this woman in a simple blue uniform. When Maria finally stopped playing, the room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping, and soon everyone was applauding loudly. Some people were cheering. A few were wiping tears from their eyes. Maria sat at the piano bench, looking a little surprised by the reaction. She had forgotten how good it felt to share music with other people. Alexander cleared his throat loudly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Well," he said, his voice not as confident as before. "That was adequate for someone with limited training." The crowd stopped clapping and looked at him with surprise. After what they had just heard, adequate seemed like a ridiculous word to use. "Of course," Alexander continued. "There were several technical errors. The tempo was inconsistent in places. Some of the fingering was not proper conservatory technique. But his criticism sounded weak and petty after what everyone had just experienced. People in the crowd started to murmur to each other, and not in a way that supported Alexander. An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd. He was well-dressed and looked like he knew about music. "Excuse me, young man," he said to Alexander, "but I have been going to concerts for 50 years, and what this young lady just played was extraordinary." "Are you a musician?" Alexander asked defensively. "I am the former director of the City Symphony," the man replied, "and I know talent when I hear it." Alexander felt panic rising in his chest. This was not how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to win easily and put this woman in her place. Instead, she had played beautifully, and now people were taking her side. "Anyone can get lucky once," Alexander said desperately. "Playing a few simple pieces does not make someone a real musician." Maria looked up at him from the piano bench. "You are right," she said calmly. "I am not a real musician. I clean hotel rooms for a living. But music is not about what job you have or how much money you make. It is about what you carry in your heart." "That is just sentimental nonsense," Alexander snapped. "Music is about discipline, training, and technical perfection. It is about years of study and practice." "Then why?" asked a woman in the crowd. "Did her playing make me cry, but yours did not?" Alexander had no answer for that. He looked around the room and saw that most people were looking at him with disappointment or even dislike. They had seen him be cruel to Maria, and now they had heard her beautiful playing. They were starting to understand what kind of person he really was. "This whole thing is ridiculous," Alexander said, his voice getting loud again. "I am a professional concert pianist. I have trained my entire life for this. You cannot compare my classical education to someone who learned a few songs from their grandmother." "Why not?" asked the former symphony director. "Music is music. Beauty is beauty. What we just heard was more moving than most professional concerts I have attended." Alexander felt like the world was turning upside down. All his life, he had been told that his expensive education and prestigious performances made him special. Now these people were saying that a hotel maid could play just as well, maybe better. "You do not understand," Alexander said, sounding almost desperate now. "There are standards in music. There are proper ways to do things. You cannot just play however you feel like playing." Maria stood up from the piano bench. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "you play very well. Your technique is perfect. But technique is just the beginning of music, not the end." "Do not lecture me about music," Alexander shot back. "I have forgotten more about piano than you will ever know." "Maybe," Maria said, "but you seem to have forgotten the most important thing of all." "Which is what?" "Why music exists in the first place." The room was completely quiet now. Everyone was watching the two of them face each other, the famous pianist in his expensive suit and the hotel worker in her simple uniform. "Music exists to touch people's hearts," Maria continued, "to bring joy, to heal pain, to help us feel less alone in the world." Alexander stood in the middle of the room, feeling more confused and angry than he had ever felt in his life. The crowd was looking at him with expressions he was not used to seeing. Instead of admiration and respect, he saw disappointment and even pity in their eyes. "You think you have won something here?" Alexander said to Maria, his voice shaking with emotion. "You think playing a few pretty songs makes you my equal?" Maria shook her head. "I never said I was your equal, Mr. Whitmore. I know you have much more training than I do." "Then what was the point of this whole display?" Alexander demanded. "What are you trying to prove?" Before Maria could answer, the hotel manager stepped forward. She looked nervous but determined. Mr. Whitmore, I think maybe we should all calm down and— No, Alexander interrupted. I am not finished yet. This woman challenged my authority as a musician. She insulted my abilities. I have a right to defend myself. The former symphony director, who had been watching quietly, spoke up again. Young man, no one insulted your abilities. Your technical skill is clearly excellent. But the young lady is right about one thing. Music is about more than just hitting the right notes. Alexander turned to face him. And what would you know about it? When did you last perform in front of a real audience? I conducted orchestras for 30 years, the older man replied calmly. I have worked with some of the greatest musicians in the world, and I can tell you that the best performers are not always the ones with the most technical training. That is ridiculous, Alexander said. Music is a science. It requires precision and discipline. You cannot just play from feeling and expect to create great art. A young woman in the crowd raised her hand. Excuse me, but can I ask you something, Mr. Whitmore? Alexander looked at her impatiently. What? When you were playing before, were you thinking about the music, or were you thinking about impressing us? The question caught Alexander off guard. What kind of question is that? I mean, when you were performing that difficult piece, what was going through your mind? Were you feeling the emotions of the music, or were you focused on showing us how skilled you are? Alexander opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The truth was that when he performed, he was usually thinking about technique. He worried about hitting every note perfectly, about showing off his speed and precision, about proving how much better he was than other pianists. A true musician thinks about both, he said finally. But which one is more important to you? The woman pressed. Alexander felt trapped. If he said technique was more important, he would sound cold and mechanical. If he said emotion was more important, he would be admitting that Maria might be right. They are equally important, he said, but his voice did not sound convincing. Maria had been listening to this exchange quietly. Now she spoke up. Mr. Whitmore, can I ask you something? What now? Alexander said with irritation. Why did you start playing piano? Alexander frowned. What do you mean? I mean, when you were very young, what made you want to learn piano? What was it about music that attracted you? Alexander thought back to his childhood. He had started piano lessons when he was 5 years old. His parents had signed him up because they thought it would be good for his education and social status. He could not really remember choosing to play piano. It had just been something he was expected to do. My parents wanted me to have a well-rounded education, he said. But did you love it? Maria asked. Did the music make you happy? Alexander was quiet for a moment. He honestly could not remember feeling joy about music when he was young. Piano had always been work for him, something to master, something to win competitions with, something to use to prove he was better than other children. I was good at it, he said finally. I had natural talent. That is not what I asked, Maria said gently. I asked if you loved it. Alexander felt uncomfortable. This conversation was going in a direction he did not like. Love is not necessary for excellence, he said. Discipline and hard work are what matter. An older woman in the crowd shook her head sadly. Oh, my dear boy, she said. Music without love is just noise. That is not true, Alexander protested. Some of the greatest composers in history were very disciplined, very focused on technique. Yes, said the former symphony director, but they also had passion. They had something to say with their music. They were not just showing off their skills. Alexander looked around the room and realized that almost everyone was disagreeing with him. These people, who should have been impressed by his credentials and reputation, were taking the side of a hotel maid who had not played piano in 10 years. You are all wrong, he said desperately. Music is not just about feelings. It is an art form that requires years of study. You cannot just sit down at a piano and expect to create something meaningful without proper training. But she did create something meaningful, said a man near the back of the room. We all heard it. Her music touched our hearts in a way that yours did not. Alexander felt like screaming. How could these people not understand? He had spent his entire life learning to play piano. He had given up normal childhood experiences to practice. He had studied with the best teachers, performed in the most prestigious venues, won the most important competitions. And now these strangers were telling him that none of that mattered as much as the simple, heartfelt playing of a woman who cleaned hotel rooms. "Fine," Alexander said, his voice getting louder. "You want to talk about feelings? You want to talk about heart? I will show you what real musical emotion looks like." He marched back to the piano and sat down hard on the bench. "You think her playing was moving? Wait until you hear what trained emotion sounds like." Alexander placed his hands on the keys and began to play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It was a piece known for its deep emotion and beautiful melody. If any piece could prove his point about the importance of technical training, this would be it. He played the opening notes with perfect precision. Every note was exactly right. Every phrase was textbook perfect. But as the music continued, something strange happened. The more perfectly Alexander played, the less emotional the music sounded. He was so focused on getting every detail right that the soul of the piece seemed to disappear. The Moonlight Sonata was supposed to be about longing and sadness and beauty, but Alexander's version sounded more like a musical exercise. The crowd listened politely, but there was none of the magic they had felt when Maria played. Several people looked bored. Others seemed disappointed. When Alexander finished, there was polite applause, but it was much quieter than the enthusiastic response Maria had received. Alexander sat at the piano, breathing hard. He could not understand what had gone wrong. He had played the piece perfectly. Every note had been correct, every timing had been precise. "That was very technically proficient," said the former symphony director diplomatically. "Technically proficient?" Alexander repeated. "That was Beethoven played exactly as it should be played." "Perhaps," said the older man. "But where was the moonlight? Where was the longing? Where was Beethoven's heart?" Alexander stood up from the piano bench, feeling frustrated and defeated. "I do not understand what you people want from me. I played one of the most beautiful pieces ever written and you act like it was boring." "It was not boring," Maria said kindly. "But it was not alive." "What does that even mean?" Alexander demanded. Maria walked closer to the piano. "May I show you something?" Alexander wanted to say no, but he was curious despite himself. "Fine." Maria sat down at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. She began to play the same Beethoven piece that Alexander had just finished. But from the very first note, everything was different. Maria played the same melody, but she made it breathe. She lingered on certain notes, rushed through others. She made some passages soft as a whisper, others strong and passionate. She was not just playing the notes. She was telling Beethoven's story. As Maria played, the room filled with the same magic that had been there during her first performance. People closed their eyes and let the music wash over them. Some swayed gently to the rhythm. Others had tears in their eyes. Alexander watched in amazement. Maria was playing the exact same piece he had just played, but it sounded completely different. It sounded like music instead of an exercise. When Maria finished, the room erupted in applause again. But this time Alexander did not feel angry or jealous. He felt something he had never experienced before. He felt like he was learning something important. "How did you do that?" he asked quietly. Maria looked at him with kind eyes. "I stopped worrying about being perfect and started thinking about what the music means." "But you made mistakes," Alexander said. "You changed the tempo in several places. That is not how the piece is supposed to be played." "Says who?" Maria asked. Says the music teachers, says the sheet music, says tradition." Maria smiled. "Mr. Whitmore, when Beethoven wrote this piece, do you think he played it exactly the same way every time?" Alexander had never thought about that before. I suppose not." "Music is not a recipe," Maria continued. "It is a conversation between the composer and the performer. Beethoven wrote down the notes, but he left room for us to add our own feelings, our own experiences. Alexander stared at her, trying to understand. Alexander stood next to the piano, staring at Maria with a look of complete confusion. His whole world was being turned upside down. Everything he had believed about music, about success, about what made someone important, was being challenged by this woman in a hotel uniform. "I do not understand," he said quietly. "If there is no right way to play music, then what was the point of all my training? What was the point of all those years of practice?" Maria could see the pain in his eyes. For the first time since this whole encounter started, she felt sorry for him. "Your training is not worthless, Mr. Whitmore. You have incredible skill. But skill is just a tool. What matters is what you do with that tool." The crowd had been listening to this conversation with great interest. Many of them were starting to understand that they were witnessing something more than just a musical competition. They were seeing one person's entire view of life being challenged. Alexander sat down heavily in one of the chairs near the piano. He looked tired and confused. "Then I have been doing everything wrong my whole life?" "No," Maria said, sitting down across from him. "You have learned to do many things very well, but maybe you forgot to ask yourself why you were doing them." Alexander thought about this. When was the last time he had played piano just because he enjoyed it? When was the last time he had chosen to play a piece because it made him feel something, rather than because it would impress an audience? He could not remember. "I used to love music," he said suddenly, surprising himself. "When I was very small, before I started taking formal lessons, I used to make up little songs on my grandmother's old piano." The crowd listened quietly as Alexander continued talking, almost as if he had forgotten they were there. "I would sit at that piano and play whatever came into my head. I did not know if it was right or wrong, I just knew it sounded good to me." Alexander's voice got softer. "But then my parents hired a proper teacher, and she told me that making up songs was not real music. Real music meant playing what great composers had written and playing it exactly right." Maria nodded. "What happened to those little songs you used to make up?" "I stopped playing them," Alexander said. "My teacher said they were childish. She said if I wanted to be a serious musician, I had to focus on classical pieces and technique." "Did you miss making up your own music?" Maria asked. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I did miss it. But I thought that missing it was part of growing up, part of becoming professional." An older woman in the crowd spoke up. "My grandson is 6 years old and he takes piano lessons. He loves to play his own little songs, but his teacher tells him the same thing, that he should only play real music." Alexander looked up at her. "Your teacher is probably right. If your grandson wants to become a good pianist, he needs to focus on proper technique." "But what if I do not want him to become a professional pianist?" the woman asked. "What if I just want him to love music?" This question hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach. He had never considered the idea that someone might learn music just for the joy of it, without wanting to become professional or win competitions. "Music should be loved first," Maria said gently. "Everything else can come later." Alexander looked around the room at all the faces watching him. These people had been moved by Maria's playing not because she was technically perfect, but because her music had come from her heart. They had listened to his perfect performance politely, but it had not touched them the same way. "I do not know how to play from the heart anymore," Alexander admitted. "I have been focused on technique for so long that I forgot how to feel the music." "It is not too late to remember," Maria said. "Music is like a language. Even if you have not spoken it for a while, it is still inside you." Alexander looked at the piano. "I do not know if I can. Every time I sit down to play, I think about all the rules, all the things my teachers told me. I cannot turn off that voice in my head." "Maybe you do not need to turn it off," Maria suggested. "Maybe you just need to add another voice, the voice that remembers why you loved music in the first place." The former symphony director stepped forward. "Young man, I have worked with many musicians over the years. The best ones were not necessarily the most technically skilled. They were the ones who could use their skill to express something real. But how do I learn to do that?" Alexander asked. How do I learn to play with feeling instead of just technique? Maria smiled. The same way you learned technique, by practicing. But this time, instead of practicing scales and exercises, you practice listening to your own heart. Alexander shook his head. That sounds very nice, but what does it actually mean? Maria thought for a moment. When you play a piece of music, instead of thinking about hitting all the right notes, try thinking about what the music is about. What story is it telling? What emotions is it trying to express? But how do I know what the composer intended? Alexander asked. You do not, Maria said. And that is okay. Music means different things to different people. What matters is what it means to you. This idea was revolutionary to Alexander. All his life he had been told that there was a correct way to interpret every piece of music, and his job was to learn that correct way and reproduce it perfectly. But what if I am wrong about what the music means? He asked. Wrong according to who? Maria replied. If your interpretation moves people, if it comes from a genuine place in your heart, how can it be wrong? Alexander felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a completely different way of thinking about music and life. It was scary, but also exciting. Will you show me? He asked suddenly. Show you what? Maria said. How to play with feeling. How to stop worrying about being perfect and start focusing on the music itself. Maria looked surprised. I am not a teacher, Mr. Whitmore. I am just someone who loves music. Maybe that is exactly what I need, Alexander said. All my teachers have been focused on technique and perfection. Maybe I need to learn from someone who remembers what music is supposed to feel like. The crowd was watching this conversation with fascination. They could see that something important was happening. A man who had built his whole identity around being better than other people was beginning to realize that there might be more to life than winning. I would be happy to share what I know, Maria said. But you have to understand, I cannot teach you technique. You already know much more about that than I do. I do not want to learn more technique, Alexander said. I want to learn how to use the technique I already have to create something beautiful. Maria nodded. That is a good place to start. She stood up and walked to the piano. Come sit with me, she said to Alexander. Let us try something together. Alexander hesitated. All his life, he had been the one in charge when it came to music. He was always the teacher, the expert, the one who knew better than everyone else. The idea of being a student again, especially to someone with less formal training, was difficult for him. But he also knew that what he had been doing was not working. His music was technically perfect but emotionally empty. If he wanted to change that, he had to be willing to try something different. He walked to the piano and sat down next to Maria on the bench. It felt strange to share the space with someone else. What piece would you like to work with? Maria asked. Alexander thought for a moment. Something simple. I think I have been focused on difficult pieces for so long that I forgot how to make simple music beautiful. Maria smiled. Simple music is often the hardest to play well, because there is nowhere to hide. Every note has to mean something. Placed her hands on the keys and played a simple melody. Just a few notes that formed a gentle, sad tune. It was nothing complicated, but the way she played it made it sound profound. Now you try, Maria said. Play the same melody, but do not think about technique. Think about what the melody makes you feel. Alexander placed his hands on the keys and played the same notes Maria had played, but his version sounded mechanical and lifeless. What were you thinking about while you played? Maria asked. I was thinking about finger position and hand placement, Alexander admitted. Try again, Maria said. This time, think about the saddest thing you can remember. Let that feeling come through your fingers. Alexander hesitated. He was not used to thinking about his emotions while playing. But he closed his eyes and thought about his grandmother, who had died when he was 12. She had been the only person in his family who had ever listened to his made-up songs without criticizing them. He played the melody again, and this time it sounded different. It was still simple, but there was something real in it, something that came from inside him rather than from his training. Better, Maria said. Do you hear the difference? Alexander nodded slowly. It sounded more alive. That is because it came from a real place inside you, Maria explained. Music is not about showing people how skilled you are. It is about sharing part of yourself with them. For the first time in years, Alexander felt like he was beginning to understand what music could really be. Alexander sat at the piano bench next to Maria, feeling like he was seeing the world with new eyes. The simple melody he had just played was still echoing in his mind, but now it carried something he had never heard in his own playing before, genuine emotion. I felt something different that time, he said quietly. When I thought about my grandmother, the music seemed to change somehow. Maria nodded. That is because you were not just playing notes anymore. You were sharing a memory, a feeling. That is what makes music alive. The crowd was still gathered around them, watching this unusual lesson with great interest. Many of them had never seen such a famous musician being so humble, so willing to learn from someone they would have considered beneath him just an hour ago. Can you show me more? Alexander asked. I want to understand how you do this. Maria thought for a moment. Let me ask you something first. When you were preparing for tonight's performance, what were you thinking about? I was thinking about the technical challenges of the piece, Alexander said. The difficult passages, the timing, making sure I did not make any mistakes. And when you were on stage performing, what went through your mind? Alexander paused, realizing something uncomfortable about himself. I was thinking about whether the audience was impressed, whether they could see how difficult what I was playing was, whether they understood that I was better than other pianists they might have heard. The words hung in the air. Several people in the crowd looked uncomfortable, and Alexander felt ashamed as he heard himself describe his motivations out loud. I see, Maria said gently, without judgment in her voice. So your focus was on yourself, your skill, your reputation, your status. Yes, Alexander admitted. It was. Now let me tell you what I was thinking about when I played earlier, Maria said. I was thinking about my grandmother, who taught me that music was a gift to be shared. I was thinking about all the times music had comforted me when I was sad or lonely. I was thinking about how lucky I was to be able to make something beautiful, even if it was just for a few minutes. Alexander listened carefully. You were thinking about other people, not about yourself? Not exactly, Maria corrected. I was thinking about the connection between myself and other people. Music is like a bridge. It connects the person playing to the people listening. But if the person playing is only thinking about themselves, the bridge cannot be built. This idea was completely new to Alexander. All his life, he had thought of performing as a way to show people how good he was. He had never considered that it might be about creating a connection with them. But how do you know what will connect with people? He asked. How do you know what they want to hear? Maria smiled. You do not try to figure out what they want to hear. You try to share something true about yourself, and you trust that other people will recognize that truth and connect with it. Alexander shook his head, still confused. But what if what is true about me is not interesting to other people? What if my feelings are too personal or strange? The most personal things are often the most universal, Maria said. Everyone has felt sadness, joy, love, loss. When you share your own experience of these feelings through music, other people recognize them and feel less alone. A woman in the crowd spoke up. That is exactly what happened when you played earlier. I do not know anything about your life, but your music made me think about my own grandmother. Alexander looked at the woman with surprise. Really? Yes, she said. The way you played that sad melody reminded me of how I felt when my grandmother passed away. It was like you understood something I had never been able to put into words. Alexander felt a strange warmth in his chest. He had never thought that his playing could help someone else process their own emotions. All his career, he had focused on impressing people, not on helping them or connecting with them. "This is very different from what I was taught," he said to Maria. "My teachers always told me that professional musicians should keep their personal feelings separate from their performance." "Why?" Maria asked simply. Alexander thought about it. Because personal feelings are unpredictable. They might make you play differently each time. They might make you make mistakes." "And would that be so terrible?" Maria asked. "Of course it would," Alexander said automatically. "Consistency is important. Audiences expect a certain level of technical perfection." Maria played a few notes on the piano, the same melody Alexander had played but with slight variations. "Do you think this sounds exactly the same as when I played it before?" Alexander listened carefully. "No, it sounds a little different." "Does it sound worse?" Alexander had to admit that it did not sound worse, just different. It had the same emotional quality, the same beauty, but with subtle changes that made it feel fresh. "Music is not like a machine," Maria explained. "It is more like a conversation. Each time you play a piece, you are having a new conversation, with the music, with yourself, with the audience. If you always say exactly the same thing in exactly the same way, it stops being a real conversation." This idea frightened Alexander. "But what if I play something completely wrong? What if I embarrass myself?" "What if you do?" Maria asked calmly. "Would that be the end of the world?" Alexander realized that his entire career had been built on the fear of making mistakes, of looking foolish, of not being perfect. This fear had driven him to practice countless hours and to perform with technical precision. But it had also prevented him from taking any risks or expressing anything real. "I have been so afraid of failing that I forgot to try to succeed at what really matters," he said slowly. "And what really matters?" Maria asked. Alexander looked around the room at all the people who had been moved by Maria's playing. Making people feel something. Creating beauty. Sharing something true. Maria nodded. "Those things are worth the risk of making mistakes," Monsieur, former symphony director, stepped forward again. "Young man, in my 30 years of conducting, I worked with many musicians who never made a single technical error. But the ones I remember, the ones who changed people's lives, were the ones who were willing to be vulnerable on stage." "Vulnerable?" Alexander repeated. "Yes. They were willing to open their hearts and share their deepest feelings through their music. Sometimes they made mistakes, but those mistakes were forgiven because the emotion was so real." Alexander thought about all the performances he had given over the years. He could remember every technical detail of his best concerts, but he could not remember feeling moved by his own playing. He had been so focused on being perfect that he had forgotten to be human. "I want to try again," he said suddenly. "Try what?" Maria asked. "I want to try playing something the way you described. Not worrying about being perfect, just focusing on sharing something real." Maria moved over to give Alexander more room at the piano. "What piece would you like to play?" Alexander thought for a moment. "Something I used to love when I was young before I became so focused on technique." He placed his hands on the keys and began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece he had learned as a teenager, but had not played in years because his teachers said it was too sentimental for serious concerts. As Alexander played, he tried to forget everything he had been taught about proper interpretation. Instead, he thought about what the music meant to him. He remembered being 15 years old, playing this piece late at night when his parents were asleep, feeling like the music understood something about his loneliness that he could not express in words. The melody flowed from his fingers differently than it ever had before. It was not perfect. He missed a few notes and his timing was not always precise. But there was something in his playing that had never been there before. Sincerity. The crowd listened in amazement. This was the same pianist who had played so coldly before, but now his music was warm and alive. They could hear the difference between technical perfection and emotional truth. When Alexander finished, he sat quietly for a moment, feeling overwhelmed by what had just happened. He had never experienced anything like it. the sense of truly expressing himself through music rather than just demonstrating his skills. The applause that followed was different from any applause he had ever received. It was not polite appreciation for technical excellence. It was genuine gratitude for something beautiful he had shared. "How do you feel?" Maria asked softly. "Different," Alexander said. "Like I just remembered something I had forgotten I knew." Maria smiled. "That is what it feels like when music comes from the right place." Alexander looked at her with new respect. "You have taught me more in the last hour than I learned in years of formal lessons." "I have not taught you anything," Maria said. "I have just helped you remember what you already knew when you were young." Alexander thought about this. It was true. The feelings he had just experienced while playing were not new. They were the same feelings he had had as a child when he made up his own songs. He had just buried them under years of training and competition and fear. "What do I do now?" he asked. "How do I take this back to my regular performances?" "You practice," Maria said. "But not the way you have been practicing. Instead of just practicing technique, practice sharing your heart." Alexander sat at the piano, still feeling the warmth from his last performance flowing through him. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he felt like he had played music instead of just notes. The feeling was both wonderful and terrifying. "I cannot believe how different that felt," he said to Maria. "It was like I was playing piano for the first time all over again." Maria nodded. "That is because you were being yourself for the first time in a long time." The crowd was still gathered around them, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of watching a competition between two people trying to prove who was better, they were witnessing something much more meaningful, one person's journey back to the heart of music. Alexander looked around at all the faces watching him. Earlier he had seen these people as an audience to impress. Now he saw them as fellow human beings who had shared in his moment of discovery. "I owe all of you an apology," he said to the crowd. "Especially you, Maria." Maria looked surprised. "You do not owe me anything, Mr. Whitmore." "Yes, I do," Alexander insisted. "I was incredibly rude to you. I treated you badly because I thought I was better than you. I was wrong about everything." The hotel manager, who had been watching nervously from the side, stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, please do not worry about it. We understand that artists can be temperamental." Alexander shook his head. "No, that is not an excuse. Being an artist does not give someone the right to treat other people with disrespect." He turned to face Maria directly. "You could have made me look foolish when I challenged you to play. You had every right to embarrass me after how I treated you. But instead, you taught me something valuable. You showed me kindness when I did not deserve it." Maria smiled gently. "Music taught me that kindness is always the right choice." "How do you mean?" Alexander asked. "My grandmother used to say that music exists to heal, not to hurt. When I play, I try to remember that. Even when someone is mean to me, I try to respond with something beautiful instead of something hurtful." Alexander felt ashamed as he thought about his own motivations for playing music. For years he had used his talent as a weapon, to prove he was superior, to make other people feel small, to build walls between himself and others. "I have been using music wrong my whole life," he said quietly. "Not wrong," Maria corrected. "Just incompletely. You have amazing skills. Now you can learn to use those skills to bring people together instead of to push them away." An elderly man in the crowd raised his hand. "Excuse me, but I have a question for both of you." "Alexander," and Maria looked at him expectantly. "Mr. Whitmore, you are a famous concert pianist, Maria. You work as a hotel housekeeper. But listening to both of you play today, I realize that talent does not care about job titles or education or money. Is that right?" Alexander thought about the question carefully. A few hours ago, he would have argued that formal training and expensive education were essential for real musical achievement. Now he was not so sure. "I think you are right," he said slowly. "I spent so much time focusing on credentials and status that I forgot that music is about something much more basic and human." Maria nodded. "Music lives in everyone. Some people, get the chance to develop it more than others, but that does not make them more worthy as human beings. A young woman in the crowd spoke up. I used to play piano when I was in high school, but I stopped because I thought I was not good enough. Listening to both of you today makes me want to start playing again. You should, Maria said immediately. Music is not about being good enough for other people. It is about having something to say and finding a way to say it. Alexander looked at the young woman. I spent years telling myself that only perfect playing was worth anything, but today I learned that perfect playing without heart is worth much less than imperfect playing with soul. The former symphony director nodded approvingly. That is the difference between a technician and an artist. Technicians can reproduce sounds perfectly. Artists create meaning. But how do you know if you are creating meaning? Alexander asked. How do you know if your music is connecting with people? You felt it tonight, Maria said. When you played that last piece, you could feel the connection happening. The music was flowing between you and everyone listening. Alexander realized she was right. During his final performance, he had been aware of the audience not as judges to impress, but as partners in creating something beautiful together. I never understood that before, he admitted. I always thought the audience was separate from me, that my job was to perform for them, not with them. Music is always a conversation, Maria explained. Even when you are playing alone, you are having a conversation with the composer, with yourself, with anyone who might hear the music later. The hotel manager looked at her watch. Mr. Whitmore, I hate to interrupt, but we do need to prepare for tonight's charity event. Your performance is scheduled to begin in 2 hours. Alexander felt a moment of panic. How could he perform in front of a formal audience after what he had just learned? Everything he thought he knew about performing had been turned upside down. I do not know if I can do it, he said. What if I try to play with feeling and I make mistakes? What if the audience does not understand what I am trying to do? Maria put her hand on his shoulder. What if you trust them to understand? What if you trust yourself to share something real? But this is a charity event, Alexander said. People paid money to hear me play. They expect a professional performance. Then give them one, Maria said. But remember that being professional does not mean being cold. It means being the best version of yourself. Alexander thought about all the charity concerts he had performed over the years. He had always approached them as opportunities to show off his skills and build his reputation. He had never thought about the actual purpose of the events, to raise money for good causes, to bring people together for something positive. What if I dedicated tonight's performance to something meaningful instead of just playing to impress people? He asked. What would you dedicate it to? Maria asked. Alexander looked around the room at all the people who had witnessed his transformation. To everyone who has ever been made to feel that they are not good enough. To everyone who has been told that their dreams do not matter because they do not have the right background or education. Maria's eyes filled with tears. That would be beautiful. Will you help me? Alexander asked suddenly. Help you how? Maria replied. Will you play with me tonight? I think I could be brave enough to try this new way of performing if I knew you were there to remind me what music is supposed to be about. Maria looked shocked. Mr. Whitmore, I cannot perform at a charity gala. I am not a professional musician. I do not have the right clothes or... None of that matters, Alexander interrupted. You have the most important thing. You understand what music is for. The crowd started murmuring excitedly at the idea of hearing both pianists perform together. But what would we play? Maria asked. Alexander smiled. Something we both love. Something that tells the story of what we learned here today. Maria looked uncertain, but the crowd was encouraging her to say yes. I would be honored, she said finally. Alexander felt a rush of excitement and nervousness. Tonight's performance would be completely different from anything he had ever done. Instead of trying to prove his superiority, he would be trying to share his humanity. There is one more thing I need to do first, Alexander said. What? Maria asked. Alexander turned to address the entire crowd. I want to tell you all something. When I arrived here today, I thought I was better than everyone in this hotel. I thought my expensive education and famous career made me more important than people who work regular jobs. The crowd listened quietly as Alexander continued. I was wrong. Completely wrong. Maria taught me that worth comes from what you give to the world, not from what the world gives to you. She taught me that kindness and humility are more valuable than any award or achievement. He paused, feeling emotional. I want to use my position and my resources to help talented people like Maria, who have not had the same opportunities I have had. I want to set up a scholarship fund for music students who cannot afford formal training. The crowd burst into woo applause. Maria looked at Alexander with surprise and gratitude. You do not have to do that, she said. Yes, I do, Alexander replied. I have been given so many advantages in life. It is time I used them to help others instead of just to make myself feel superior. As the crowd began to disperse to prepare for the evening's event, Alexander felt like a completely different person than the one who had walked into the hotel that morning. He had come expecting to give a performance that would impress people with his skills. Instead, he had learned that the most impressive thing about any person is their capacity for growth, kindness, and genuine connection with others. 2 hours later, the hotel's main ballroom was filled with elegantly dressed guests who had come to support the charity event. The room buzzed with conversation and excitement. Many people had heard rumors about something unusual happening earlier, between the famous pianist and a hotel employee, but no one knew exactly what to expect. Alexander stood backstage, wearing his formal concert tuxedo, but feeling completely different from how he usually felt before a performance. Instead of reviewing technical passages and worrying about impressing the audience, he was thinking about the conversation he'd had with Maria and the promise he'd made to himself to play from his heart. Maria stood beside him, wearing a simple but elegant black dress that the hotel manager had found for her. She looked nervous but determined. She had never performed in front of such a formal audience before, but Alexander's invitation had meant more to her than he could know. Are you ready? Alexander asked her quietly. I think so, Maria replied. Are you? Alexander smiled. I am, more ready than I have ever been, and more nervous than I have ever been. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Maria said. When you care about something deeply, it should make you nervous. It means it matters. The hotel manager approached them. Mr. Whitmore, they are ready for you on stage. Alexander took a deep breath. Ladies and gentlemen, he said to the small group backstage, tonight you are going to hear something different from my usual performances. I hope you will understand why. He and Maria walked onto the stage together. The audience murmured with curiosity when they saw the hotel employee accompanying the famous pianist. Alexander stepped up to the microphone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to support this important charity. Before we begin tonight's performance, I want to tell you about something that happened to me today. The audience settled into attentive silence. This afternoon, I met someone who taught me more about music in 1 hour than I had learned in the previous 20 years. Her name is Maria Santos, and she works here at the hotel. When I first met her, I judged her based on her job and her appearance. I thought I was better than her because of my education and career. Alexander paused, feeling the weight of his confession. I was completely wrong. Maria showed me that real musical talent has nothing to do with fancy degrees or expensive training. It has everything to do with having something genuine to share with the world. She taught me that music is not about proving you are better than other people. It is about connecting with other people. The audience listened with growing interest. Many of them had attended Alexander's concerts before and had always found his playing technically impressive but emotionally cold. Tonight, Maria and I will perform together. This performance is dedicated to everyone who has ever been told they are not good enough, everyone who has had to give up their dreams because of circumstances beyond their control, and everyone who believes that kindness and humility are more important than status and wealth. Alexander stepped back from the microphone and walked to the piano with Maria. They sat down together on the bench, just as they had that afternoon. What should we play? Maria whispered. Something that tells our story, Alexander replied. something that shows how two very different people can create something beautiful together. Alexander began to play a gentle melody, the same simple tune that Maria had taught him earlier. But now he played it with confidence and feeling. As he played, Maria joined in with a harmony line, her notes weaving around his melody like a conversation between old friends. The audience was immediately captivated. This was nothing like Alexander's usual solo performances. The music was simpler, but it was alive with warmth and genuine emotion. As they played, Alexander and Maria began to improvise together. Alexander would play a phrase and Maria would answer with her own variation. Then Maria would introduce a new melody, and Alexander would find ways to support and enhance it. The music they created together was unlike anything either of them had ever played before. It combined Alexander's technical skill with Maria's emotional honesty. It was sophisticated but accessible, complex but heartfelt. The audience found themselves leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed in what they were hearing. This was not a performance to be admired from a distance. It was an invitation to share in something beautiful and real. As the improvisation continued, both pianists became completely lost in the music. They forgot about the audience, forgot about their different backgrounds, forgot about everything except the joy of creating something together. When they finally brought the piece to a close, the ballroom was completely silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping, and soon the entire audience was on their feet, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Alexander and Maria stood up and bowed together. Alexander could see tears in the eyes of several audience members. He had never received a response like this to any of his performances. "Thank you," Alexander said into the microphone. "That is what music sounds like when it comes from the heart instead of from the ego." After the performance, people crowded around both pianists, wanting to talk about what they had just experienced. Many audience members said it was the most moving musical performance they had ever attended. An elderly woman approached Maria with tears in her eyes. "My dear, your playing reminded me of my late husband. He used to say that music was the language of the soul." A young man shook Alexander's hand enthusiastically. "Mr. Whitmore, I have heard you perform many times, but tonight was different. Tonight your music made me feel something." As the evening continued, Alexander watched Maria interact with the guests. She was gracious and humble, but also confident in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance. She answered questions about her musical background honestly, without trying to make herself sound more impressive than she was. Later, when most of the guests had gone home, Alexander and Maria sat together in the now quiet ballroom. "Thank you," Alexander said. "Tonight was the best performance of my career." "It was my first real performance," Maria replied. "I will never forget it." "I meant what I said about the scholarship fund," Alexander told her. "I want to help other people like you get the opportunities you should have had." Maria looked thoughtful. "That is very generous. But I want you to know that I do not feel sorry for myself about missing opportunities. My life has been different from yours, but it has not been wasted. Working regular jobs, struggling to make ends meet, taking care of my family, all of that taught me things that no music school could have taught me." Alexander nodded. "You are right. Your experiences made your music more real, more meaningful than anything I learned in conservatory. And your training gave you skills that I could never develop on my own," Maria said. "Tonight we both shared our gifts. That is what made the music so special." 3 months later, Alexander and Maria performed together again at the opening concert for the Whitmore Music Foundation, the scholarship program Alexander had established. The foundation provided musical education and opportunities for talented students from low-income families. By that time, Alexander had become a completely different kind of performer. His concerts were no longer cold displays of technical perfection. They were warm, emotional experiences that left audiences feeling uplifted and connected. Maria had accepted a position as the foundation's first scholarship recipient and was studying music education while continuing to work part-time at the hotel. She planned to become a teacher who would help other students learn that music was about much more than just hitting the right notes. The two remained close friends, often performing together, and always reminding each other that the most important thing about music was not how perfectly you could play it, but how honestly you could share your heart through it. Alexander learned that true success was not about being better than other people, but about using your gifts to make the world a little more beautiful. And Maria learned that her dreams had not been lost when she had to give up formal music training. They had just been waiting for the right time to bloom. Years later, when people asked Alexander about the moment that changed his life, he would always talk about the day a hotel housekeeper taught him the difference between playing notes and making music. He would tell them that the most valuable lesson he ever learned was that talent without humility is just noise, but talent combined with kindness can change the world. And whenever Maria was asked about her most memorable performance, she would smile and say that the most beautiful music happens when people stop trying to prove they are better than each other and start trying to create something wonderful together. The piano in the Grandview Hotel lobby still sits in the same spot where their musical duel took place, but now it carries a small plaque that reads, "Music is the bridge that connects all hearts, regardless of where they come from or where they are going." Sometimes, late at night when the hotel is quiet, staff members say they can still hear faint melodies drifting from the piano room, not the sound of someone practicing scales or showing off their technique, but the sound of music being played with love, the way it was always meant to be played.